The emergency signal tore through the fabric of space itself, a desperate scream that echoed across thousands of light years. It was the kind of signal that hadn't been used in over 200 years, not since the last Great War that had nearly destroyed half the known galaxy. Now it was active again, pulsing with a frequency that made every civilized species in the sector stop what they were doing and listen. The Galactic Council chambers, normally a place of careful debate and measured diplomacy, had descended into something close to panic. Representatives from dozens of species crowded the main floor, their voices rising in a cacophony of different languages and tones. Some were clicking, some were humming, others were speaking in frequencies that human ears couldn't even detect. But the message was universal. They were losing and losing badly. For 3 full cycles, which translated to roughly 90 standard days, the Vaxian Imperium had been carving through the Chronos sector like a hot knife through butter. Their ships were unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. They didn't just destroy enemy vessels. They obliterated them so completely that sometimes there wasn't even debris left to recover. Their weapons worked on principles that the Council's best scientists couldn't understand, and their tactics were ruthlessly efficient. 17 species had already fallen, not just their military forces, but entire civilizations. The Vaxians didn't take prisoners, didn't accept surrender, and didn't negotiate. They simply swept through system after system, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. Worlds that had stood for thousands of years were now empty, their populations either dead or scattered to the cosmic winds. Ambassador Kelver stood at his station, his 4 eyes tracking the holographic display that showed the current battle map. Each red that represented a Vaxian position. There were so many of them now that parts of the map looked like they were bleeding. The blue dots, representing Allied forces, were few and far between. He watched as another blue dot flickered and went dark. Another relay station destroyed. Another 1,000 lives lost in an instant. His species, the Tarveen, had been part of the Galactic Council for over 5,000 years. They were known as peacemakers, diplomats who could find common ground between the most unlikely of allies. But there was no common ground with the Vaxians. They had tried. Oh, how they had tried. Every attempt at communication had been met with silence, followed by attacks. Kelver's attention drifted to the observer section, an area of a chamber where newer species sat, species that hadn't yet earned full voting rights in the council. His gaze settled on a single human, sitting alone in the back row, Admiral James Mitchell, the only representative humanity had sent. The humans were an odd case. They had only made contact with the greater galactic community 20 years ago, emerging from their small corner of space with crude but functional faster than light drives. The Council had accepted them with the usual probationary status, expecting them to spend the next century or so learning the ways of civilized spacefaring society. Most species found humans puzzling. They were emotional, often irrational, and they had a disturbing tendency to solve problems with violence. Their own planet was still divided into hundreds of competing nations. They still had wars among themselves, for reasons that seemed absurd to more advanced civilizations. Resources, territory, ideology. The Council had assumed that humanity would eventually outgrow these primitive behaviors. Because of this, no one had seriously considered asking the humans for help. What could a species that couldn't even achieve peace on their own world possibly offer? Their technology was laughable compared to Vaxian weapons. Their ships were built from simple alloys and metals, not the advanced materials that proper warships used. They had no unified command structure, no central government that spoke for all of humanity. But as Kelver watched another relay station fall, as he calculated that they had maybe 12 hours before the Vaxians reached Station Harmony, where 6 billion refugees were sheltering, he realized they were out of options. Every major military power in the sector had already committed their forces. All of them had been destroyed or crippled. The humans were the only ones who hadn't been asked, simply because no one thought they would make a difference. Kelver made his way through the chaos of the council floor, weaving between panicking delegates and military advisors shouting conflicting strategies. He climbed the steps to the observer section, his movements heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. As he approached Admiral Mitchell, he tried to think of the right words. How do you ask for help from someone you spent 2 decades dismissing as primitive? The human sat perfectly still, his face showing no emotion as he watched the tactical displays. Kelver had studied human expressions during his time on the Council. He knew that this blank look could mean many things. Concentration, perhaps, or maybe Mitchell was simply shocked into silence like everyone else. When Kelver finally stood before him, he opened his mouth to begin what he planned as a carefully worded request, an appeal to humanity's better nature, perhaps a promise of future considerations, maybe even a formal apology for how they had been treated. But before he could speak, Mitchell looked up at him with eyes that were far too calm for the situation. The human spoke first, his voice quiet but clear. "We'll be there in 18 hours. Just like that. No demands. No negotiations. No anger being overlooked until the last possible moment. Just a simple statement of fact. Kelver felt all three of his hearts sink at once. 18 hours. The sector would fall in 12. The human couldn't know, that even if they sent every ship they had, it wouldn't be enough. The Vaxians had 4,000 capital ships in the sector. Intelligence suggested the humans had maybe 100 vessels total, scattered across their own space. But as Kelver looked into Mitchell's steady gaze, he saw something that made him pause. There was no fear there, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that chilled him more than the Vaxian advance ever had. The fabric of space rippled and tore as the human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel. It had been 16 hours since Admiral Mitchell made his promise, and against all odds, he had delivered. The transition from FDL to normal space created brilliant flashes of light that lit up the darkness at the edge of the Chronos sector, like stars being born all at once. Station Harmony was dying. The massive orbital platform, built to house millions in times of peace, now sheltered over 6 billion refugees who had fled from conquered worlds. It was never meant to withstand a military assault. Its shields were civilian-grade, designed to deflect asteroids and space debris, not military weapons. The station's few defensive batteries had already been firing for hours, but they were hopelessly outmatched. The Vaxian armada surrounded the station like predators circling wounded prey. 4,000 capital ships, each one a masterpiece of biocrystalline engineering. Their hulls weren't made of metal but grown from living materials that could repair themselves in battle. Their weapons drew power directly from captured stars, channeled through organic conduits that pulsed with eerie purple light. To look at a Vaxian warship was to see something that was both machine and creature, technology and biology fused into something that defied natural law. The Allied forces that remained were scattered throughout the sector, reduced to running fights and desperate survival tactics. Ships that had once been part proud fleets now operate alone or in small groups, their crews exhausted and their ammunition running low. They had sent out dozens of distress calls, knowing that no help was coming. They stayed anyway, buying time with their lives, hoping that somehow the civilians on Station Harmony might find a way to evacuate. But there was nowhere to evacuate to. Every system within reasonable distance had already fallen or was under attack. The Vaxians had planned this perfectly, cutting off all escape routes before beginning their final assault. This was to be their crowning achievement, the moment when the Galactic Councils would finally break. Then the sensors started screaming. Every ship in the sector, Vaxian and Allied alike, detected the massive surge of energy as the human fleet dropped out of FDL. Communication officers scrambled to identify the new arrivals. Tactical computers began counting and cataloging the vessels. The Allied forces felt a brief surge of hope, then crushing disappointment. They had expected maybe a dozen ships, perhaps 24 if humanity had truly committed everything they had. Instead, the sensors showed 300 vessels, which sounded impressive until you remembered that they were facing 4,000 Vaxian warships. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the knife was made of wood, and the gun was a plasma cannon. On the bridge of the Vaxian flagship, War Commander Vrathic studied the tactical display with 3 of his 6 eyes, while the others monitored his ship systems. He was old by Vaxian standards, having lived through 17 conquests and never once tasting defeat. His body was heavily modified with biomechanical enhancements that made him as much a part of his ship as any component. When his sensors officer reported the human fleet's arrival, Vrathic felt something he rarely experienced: amusement. He had read the intelligence reports on humanity. Their ships were built from iron and steel, materials so primitive that most species only use them for decorative purposes. They still use chemical propellants for some of their weapons. Chemical propellants, like something from the ancient times before civilization, had learned to harness the fundamental forces of a universe. The tactical displays showed the human formation, and Vrathic's amusement grew. The ships were arranged in a pattern that made no sense according to any known military doctrine. They weren't in a defensive sphere, weren't in attack wedges, weren't even in the simple line formations that primitive species usually favored. Instead, they were scattered across a wide area in what looked almost random, with varying distances between vessels and no apparent logic to their positioning. Vrathic made a decision that would haunt the Vaxian military histories for generations to come. He didn't even commit his full force. Why waste resources on such an insignificant threat? He selected a single battle group, 200 ships, and transmitted the order: eliminate the humans quickly and return to the primary objective. He expected the engagement to last perhaps 10 minutes, maybe 15 if the humans tried to run. His communications officer reported an incoming transmission from the human fleet. Vrathic almost ignored it, but curiosity made him accept. Perhaps the humans wanted to surrender? That would be amusing. The face that appeared on his view screen was a human female, her features composed and calm. She wore a uniform that seemed almost absurdly simple compared to the elaborate biosuits that Vaxian officers wore. Her name, according to the translation protocols, was Commander Rebecca Hayes. She looked directly at the camera, directly at Vrathic, and spoke in a flat, emotionless tone that the translator rendered perfectly. Recording for posterity. Engaging hostiles. That was it. No threats, no demands, no last-minute pleas for mercy. Just a simple statement of fact, as if she were noting the weather or recording a routine equipment check. Then the transmission ended. Vrathic felt the first stirring of something that might have been unease, but he dismissed it. The human commander was trying to project confidence she couldn't possibly feel. It was a psychological tactic, nothing more. He watched his battle group begin their approach, their biocrystalline hulls shimmering with stored energy, weapons charging for the inevitable slaughter. The human ships didn't run. They didn't even try to evade. Instead, they began moving forward, accelerating directly toward the approaching Vaxian vessels. It was suicide, pure and simple. The range was still too great for effective weapons fired by primitive standards, but the humans kept coming, their formation shifting in ways that Vrathic's tactical computers couldn't predict or model. In the command center Station Harmony, thousands of observers watched the sensor feeds in horrified silence. The humans were outnumbered 10-1 by just a Vaxian battle group, and those ships were among the most powerful weapons ever created. There was no scenario where this ended well. The humans were brave, certainly perhaps foolishly so, but bravery didn't stop weapons that could vaporize a planet. The range continued to close. 500,000 kilometers. 400,000. 300,000. Still the humans came on, and still they didn't fire. In the minds of every military officer watching, a single question formed. What were they waiting for? Then, at a range that made absolutely no sense for energy weapons, the human ships opened fire, and the galaxy learned that humanity had been holding back far more than anyone imagined. The first volley from the human fleet didn't look like anything the galaxy recognized as weapons fire. There were no brilliant beams of coherent light, no streams of superheated plasma, no exotic particles that bent the laws of physics. Instead, there are just small objects moving impossibly fast through the void of space. Tungsten rods, each one weighing several tons, accelerated by magnetic rails to a significant fraction of light speed. The Vaxians had never seen kinetic weapons used at this scale, because every civilized species had abandoned them thousands of years ago. Why throw rocks when you could harness the power of stars? But humanity had taken an ancient concept and pushed it to its absolute extreme. The rods hit the Vaxian shields and simply ignored them. Energy shields were designed to disperse heat and redirect particle beams. They were perfect defenses against every known weapon in the galaxy. But these weren't energy weapons. These were solid mass moving at velocities that turned physics into a nightmare. The shields flicker and died as the rods punched through, each impact releasing energy equivalent to a small nuclear explosion. The first Vaxian ship died in complete silence, its biocrystalline hull shattering like glass. The second and third followed within heartbeats. Then 10 more. Then 50. The Vaxian battle group's formation disintegrated as captains desperately tried to evade an attack they couldn't understand or counter. But the railguns were just the opening move. The human ships launched what the sensors identified as missiles, though they moved with a precision and intelligence that suggested something far more sophisticated. These weren't dumb projectiles following ballistic paths. Each missile had its own guidance system, its own tiny brain that could think and react and adapt. The Vaxian point defense systems opened fire, their bioenergy weapons creating a deadly web of intersecting beams designed to vaporize incoming threats. They destroyed the first wave of missiles easily. Then the second wave came in from a different angle. Then a third from another direction. Then a fourth. The missiles were coordinating with each other, learning from each wave that was destroyed, adapting their approach patterns. Some missiles made it through. Instead of exploding on contact with the Vaxian hulls, they burrowed. Shaped charges designed with frightening precision cut through armor like it wasn't there, and then the nuclear warheads detonated inside the ships. Not the massive, wasteful fusion bombs of primitive warfare, but carefully calibrated devices that released just enough energy in exactly the right place to cause catastrophic damage. War Commander Vrathic watched his tactical display in growing disbelief as ship after ship went dark. His sensors were reporting impossible things. The human vessels were firing thousands of projectiles, but none of them were hitting each other. The coordination required was beyond what even the Vaxian collective consciousness could achieve. How were these primitives managing it? Then his shields failed, and he understood he had seconds to live. A tungsten rod traveling at 40% of light speed hit his flagship dead center. The biocrystalline structure that had taken decades to grow and shape simply ceased to exist, converted to superheated plasma in a fraction of a second. For minutes. That's how long it took for 200 Vaxian warships to become debris and radiation. For minutes to destroy a force that should have been invincible. The remaining Vaxian fleet, still surrounding Station Harmony, received the tactical data, and for the first time in their species' history, experienced collective shock. Their commanders reviewed the recordings again and again, trying to understand how this was possible. These were humans, primitives. Their ships were made of metal. They shouldn't have been able to do this. But shock turned quickly to rage, and rage turned to determination. The humans had used surprise and unconventional tactics, but they were still outnumbered more than 10 to 1. The full might of the Vaxian Armada, nearly 4,000 ships, turned away from Station Harmony and began accelerating toward the human fleet. Vrathic's replacement, a war commander named Zelphic, transmitted on all frequencies. This wasn't just about conquest anymore. This was about revenge. The humans would be obliterated, and their home world would burn. No species attacked the Vaxian Imperium and survived. The human response came from Commander Hayes again, her voice still calm and measured. All ships, proceed to formation Delta 7. Weapons free. Show them why we stopped fighting each other. The human fleet began to move, and every military observer watching suddenly understood that they hadn't seen humanity's true capability yet. The ships didn't maneuver like separate vessels anymore. They flowed through space like a single organism, each ship responding to the others with impossible precision. When one ship turned, 50 others adjusted their positions in perfect synchronization. When one fired, others created overlapping fields of fire that left no gaps. The Vaxians had better ships, better weapons, better technology by every measurable standard. But the humans had something else. They had spent their entire history fighting wars against themselves, against opponents who could think and adapt and surprise them. Every conflict, every battle, every skirmish in human history had been a lesson in tactical innovation. The Vaxian fleet came in with overwhelming force, certain that numbers would prevail. The humans introduced them to electronic warfare. Signals beamed directly at the biocrystalline ships, exploiting the fact that living materials could be confused, could be tricked. Vaxian ships suddenly couldn't tell friend from enemy. Their weapon systems locked onto their own vessels. Their navigation computers fed them false data. The vaccine formation collapsed into chaos. Ships collided with each other. Friendly fire tore through their ranks. Commanders screamed orders that their ship systems couldn't process correctly. And through it all, the human fleet kept moving, kept firing, kept adapting. The point defense systems on the human ships proved to be the final revelation. Every vaccine shot that came anywhere near a human vessel was intercepted, not by energy shields, but by thousands of small projectiles fired with computer-guided precision. The humans had taken the concept of automated defenses and perfected it to an art form. Their systems could track and destroy hundreds of incoming threats simultaneously, creating an impenetrable barrier of metal and mathematics. 3 minutes after engaging the full vaccine fleet, it was over. The armada that had conquered 17 species, that had been the terror of the sector, simply ceased to exist. Some ships were destroyed outright. Others were disabled. Their systems crashed. Their crews trapped inside hulks that wouldn't respond to commands. A few tried to run, but the human missiles hunted them down with relentless efficiency. Station Harmony's command center sat in absolute silence. The tactical displays showed 300 green dots. The human fleet, exactly where they had started. Not one had gone dark. Not one showed significant damage. Human casualties, 0. In the span of 7 minutes, humanity had rewritten every military doctrine in the galaxy. The silence in Station Harmony's command center was so complete that the ambient hum of life support systems seemed deafening. Hundreds of military officers, civilian administrators, and council representatives stood frozen, their eyes locked on the tactical displays that showed what should have been impossible. The Vaxian Armada, the unstoppable force that had crushed 17 civilizations, was gone. Just gone. Scattered debris floated where thousands of warships had been minutes before. Then every screen in the command center flickered and switched to the same image. Admiral James Mitchell's face appeared, transmitted simultaneously to every vessel, every station, and every relay point in the sector. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A heaviness that spoke of costs paid and prices weighed. His voice came through clearly, translated into hundreds of languages by automated systems. The hostile force has been neutralized. All surviving Vaxian vessels are disabled and contained. We've deployed rescue teams to evacuate their wounded. Our medical ships are standing by to assist with refugee care and any injured Allied personnel who require assistance. The statement was delivered with the calm professionalism of a routine status report, as if he had just completed a minor patrol rather than winning what would certainly be remembered as one of the most decisive military victories in galactic history. But it was what he said next that made several species in the command center take involuntary steps backward. We're also transmitting docking coordinates for any disabled Allied vessels that need repair assistance. Our engineering teams are equipped to work with most known ship designs. We'll help however we can. Ambassador Kelver felt his hands trembling as he gripped the railing in front of him. Around the command center, he could see the same reaction rippling through the crowd. The humans had just demonstrated capacity for overwhelming violence, had shown they could destroy the most powerful military force in the known galaxy with almost casual efficiency. And now they were offering medical aid and engineering support like nothing had happened. Mitchell's image on the screen shifted slightly, and for the first time, something cracked through that professional exterior. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, there was an edge to his voice that made it clear these next words mattered deeply to him. The Galactic Council questioned our fitness of membership because we still wage war among ourselves. Many of you wondered, some aloud and others in private, how a species that hasn't achieved internal peace could possibly contribute to galactic civilization. You looked at our history and saw violence and conflict, and you judged us as primitive because of it. The command center remained deathly quiet. No one dared interrupt. Several council members who had been most vocal about humanity's probationary status found themselves unable to meet the Admiral's gaze, even through a view screen. Mitchell continued, and now there was no hiding the emotion in his voice. You were right to question us. We do still fight among ourselves. We have wars over resources, over territory, over ideas about how people should live and what they should believe. We haven't solved these problems. We haven't achieved the peace that you all take for granted." He paused, and the silence stretched out for several heartbeats. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but somehow more intense. "But that's exactly why we know how to do this. We know war because we've never stopped studying it, preparing for it, trying to end it. Every conflict in our history taught us lessons. Every battle showed us new ways that people could hurt each other, and new ways to prevent that hurt. We learned these lessons in blood and fire, and we spent centuries trying to make sure we never forget them." Kelver felt something cold settle in his chest. It wasn't fear of violence, exactly. It was a fear of understanding something fundamental about a species that had seemed so straightforward, so simple to categorize. The humans weren't warriors by nature, any more than any other species, but they had become something far more frightening. They were survivors who had learned that the only way to prevent war was to become better at it than anyone who would start one. "We didn't want to be good at this," Mitchell said, and now his voice carried a weight of genuine regret. "Every human military academy starts its training with the same lesson. War is a failure. It's what happens when every other option has been exhausted. We spend billions teaching our officers how to negotiate, how to de-escalate, how to find peaceful solutions. We also teach them that when someone chooses violence, when someone decides that genocide is acceptable, there has to be someone willing and able to stop them." The screen showed images now, pulled from a human fleet's combat recordings. Vaxian ships being disabled rather than destroyed when possible. Rescue pods being launched toward crippled vessels. Medical teams preparing to treat wounded enemies. The humans had won with overwhelming force, but they had also shown restraint where restraint was possible. "You asked how we could contribute to galactic civilization," Mitchell said. "Here's our answer. We'll be the ones who remember. We'll remember that peace doesn't maintain itself. We'll remember that there will always be those who choose to take what they want by force. And we'll be the ones who stop them, not because we want to, but because we learned a long time ago that if good people can't defend themselves and others, then goodness itself becomes meaningless." Around the command center, the reaction was mixed. Some species looked relieved, seeing humanity as a protector they desperately needed. Others looked terrified, recognizing that they had invited something dangerous into their midst. A few looked thoughtful, already calculating how this changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Kelver, watching Mitchell's face on the screen, felt all three reactions at once. The humans had just saved 6 billion lives. They had stopped an extinction-level threat that had paralyzed the Council with fear. But they had also demonstrated a capability for organized violence that exceeded anything in recorded history. Mitchell's final words were delivered softly, but they carried to every corner of the station. "We're not asking for gratitude. We're not demanding payment or recognition. We did what needed to be done because that's what you do when innocent people are threatened. But understand this. We won't be underestimated again. We won't sit quietly in the observers section while you debate our worthiness. We've proven ourselves in the only language that the Vaxians understood. Now we'll see if the rest of the galaxy can learn to speak a different one." The transmission ended, and the screens returned to showing the tactical display. The human fleet remained in formation, their weapons powered down, but clearly ready. They weren't making threats, but the implication was clear enough. Humanity had changed the rules, and the galaxy would have to adapt. Kelver found himself wondering if they had made a mistake in calling the humans for help, not because they had failed to stop the Vaxians, but because they had succeeded too well. The galaxy had just learned that the species they had dismissed as primitive had been holding back. The question now was, what else were the humans capable of? One cycle later, which translated to roughly 30 standard days, the Galactic Council reconvened in their grand chamber. The mood was drastically different from the panic that had consumed them during the Vaxian assault. Now there was tension of a different kind, the kind that came from having to fundamentally reconsider assumptions that had gone unchallenged for thousands of years. The debate had been raging for hours. Representatives from over 100 species filled the chamber, and for once, the usual careful diplomatic language had been abandoned in favor of raw honesty. The question before them was simple to state, but impossibly complex to answer. What do we do about humanity? A delegate from the Korthan Empire, their crystalline form refracting light across the chamber, argued passionately for immediate military integration. They saved us. They stopped an enemy we couldn't defeat. We should grant them full authority over all defensive operations in the galaxy. Let them organize our fleets, train our officers, modernize our capabilities. The Corthan's voice resonated with harmonics that conveyed deep respect bordering on worship. But not everyone agreed. A representative from the Pelthine Collective, a species known for their philosophical approach to governance, stood in opposition. We cannot ignore what we witnessed. These humans possess a capacity for violence that exceeds anything in our records. Yes, they saved us. But what happens when they decide they don't need our permission anymore? What happens when they turn those weapons on us? The argument went back and forth, growing more heated with each exchange. Some species proposed studying human military tactics and trying to replicate their success. Others wanted strict limitations placed on human fleet movements and weapons development. A few, mostly those whose worlds have been devastated by the Vaxians, suggested giving humanity whatever they wanted as payment for their intervention. Through it all, a single human sat in what was no longer the observer section. Captain Diana Morgan had been sent to represent humanity's interests in these proceedings. She was younger than Admiral Mitchell, probably in her mid-30s by human standards, with dark hair pulled back in a simple style, and wearing the same unadorned uniform that seemed to be standard for human military personnel. She listened to the debate with an expression that gave nothing away. When delegates argued for giving humanity power, she didn't smile. When they argued for restricting human activities, she didn't frown. She simply sat and listened, occasionally making notes on a small device that several species had identified as remarkably primitive compared to standard galactic technology. Finally, after nearly 6 hours of circular arguments, Ambassador Kelver stood and called for order. His voice, enhanced by the chamber's acoustic systems, cut through the noise. We can debate hypotheticals all day, but perhaps we should hear from the humans themselves. Captain Morgan, you've been patient with our discussions. Do you wish to address the council? Every eye in the chamber turned to the human. Morgan stood slowly, straightening her uniform, and made her way to the central speaking platform. She moved with a casual confidence that some species found reassuring and others found unsettling. When she reached the platform, she didn't immediately speak. Instead, she pulled out a small holographic projector and set it on the podium. Thank you, Ambassador Kelver, and thank you to the Council for allowing me to speak. I've listened to your concerns, and I understand them. You've seen what humanity can do in war, and now you're wondering what that means for peace. That's a fair question. The holographic projector activated, and images filled the air above the speaking platform. They weren't images of warships or weapons or military installations. Instead, they showed Earth, parks filled with people relaxing under trees. Schools where children of different ethnicities played together. Hospitals where doctors worked to save lives. Libraries, museums, concert halls. Farms where crops grew in carefully tended rows. Cities that gleamed with lights at night, bustling with millions of people going about their daily lives. This is what humanity is, Morgan said quietly. We're not warriors by nature. We're gardeners who like to watch things grow. We're teachers who get excited when students understand something new. We're engineers who stay up late solving problems. We're artists who try to capture beauty in all its forms. We're parents who worry about our children's futures. We're neighbors who help each other when times are hard. She paused, letting the images continue to cycle. A grandmother teaching a child to read. Scientists celebrating a breakthrough in their laboratory. Musicians performing for a crowd. Construction workers building homes. Were all these things first? The military capability you witnessed? That's what we had to become, not what we wanted to be. The images shifted, showing darker scenes now. Ancient battlefields, ruined cities, memorials covered with names. Our history is full of conflicts. We fought over everything you can imagine. Resources, territory, religion, ideology. We've hurt each other in ways that still haunt us generations later. Every human child learns about these conflicts in school. We don't hide from our past. We study it, we remember it, and we ask ourselves the same question over and over. How do we stop this from happening again? Morgan's voice grew stronger, more passionate. We never found a perfect answer. We still have disagreements. We still have tensions between our nations. But we learned something important through all that pain. We learned that the only way to protect peace is to be better at war than anyone who would threaten it. Not because we love fighting, but because we love everything that fighting destroys. She deactivated the holographic projector and looked directly at the assembled council. So here's what we're proposing. Humanity will establish a defense academy. It will be open to any species that wants to send students. We'll teach military tactics, strategy, weapons development, fleet coordination, everything we know. Not so you can be like us, but so you'll never need us to save you again. The chamber erupted in a dozen simultaneous conversations. Some delegates were nodding enthusiastically. Others looked skeptical. A few appeared outright alarmed at the idea of spreading human military knowledge across the galaxy. Morgan raised her hand for quiet. I know some of you are worried. You're thinking we'll create a galaxy full of warriors. But that's not how it works. Knowledge isn't dangerous by itself. What's dangerous is ignorance. The Vaxians nearly destroyed you because you have forgotten that sometimes peace requires a capacity for violence. You had grown so accustomed to safety that you couldn't recognize a real threat until it was almost too late. She pulled up one final image, this one showing human soldiers helping to rebuild a destroyed city. We'll teach you how to fight, but more importantly, we'll teach you why fighting should always be the last resort. We'll share the lessons we learned in blood, so you can learn them in classrooms instead. We'll show you how to build defenses so strong that no one dares attack you. And we'll teach you how to recognize when someone is preparing for war, so you're never caught off guard again. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Humanity wouldn't take control of galactic defense. They wouldn't demand special privileges or authority. They would simply share what they knew and let each species decide how to use that knowledge. It gave the Council what they needed without requiring them to hand over power to a species they still barely understood. The vote, when it finally came, wasn't unanimous. There were still those who feared humanity, who wanted to maintain distance and impose restrictions. But the majority recognized the opportunity being offered. Humanity's probationary status was officially ended. They were granted full membership in the Galactic Council, with all the rights and responsibilities that came with it. But there was one addition to their membership that had never been granted to any species before. A new title, created specifically for this moment. Guardians of the Pax Galactica. It wasn't a position of command or authority. It was a recognition of what humanity had proven themselves to be, protectors who understood the cost of protection. As the vote was recorded and the chamber began to empty, Ambassador Kelver found himself standing at one of the observation windows that looked out into space. The human fleet was preparing to depart, their ships moving with that same precise coordination that had devastated the Vaxians. Captain Morgan approached and stood beside him, also watching the fleet. "You're afraid of us," Morgan said quietly. It wasn't a question. Kelver considered denying it, but what would be the point? "Yes," he admitted. "You're the most dangerous species I've ever encountered." "Good," Morgan replied, surprising him. "You should be afraid, not of what we'll do to you, but what someone like the Vaxians could have done if we hadn't been here. That fear, that understanding that danger exists, that's what will keep you vigilant." She turned to look at him directly. The most terrifying Guardians, Ambassador, are the ones who know exactly how terrible war is and choose to master it anyway. Not because we enjoy it, but because someone has to stand between civilization and chaos. We've carried that burden for our entire history. Now we're offering to share it, so others won't have to carry it alone. The human fleet jumped to faster than light, leaving behind a galaxy that would never be quite the same. Kelver remained at the window long after they disappeared, thinking about Morgan's words. The galaxy had changed in ways that went far beyond military capability. They had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about peace and safety and the cost of maintaining both. Humanity hadn't just saved them from the Vaxians. They had given them a mirror to see themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time in millennia. The galaxy had grown comfortable in its peace, had forgotten that peace required constant vigilance, and the willingness to defend it. Now they would learn those lessons from teachers who had paid for that knowledge with centuries of their own suffering. As Kelver finally turned away from the window, he found himself hoping that the rest of the galaxy would prove worthy of the gift humanity was offering. Because if there was one thing he now understood with absolute certainty, it was that the humans hadn't shown them everything they were capable of. What they had witnessed in the Chronos sector was humanity being merciful, and that thought, more than anything else, kept him awake for many nights to come.